Just very briefly, I was asked to speak about nonviolent Christianity for increasingly violent times, theology and practice for forming nonviolent individuals and communities. It was a tall order. And I just want to start with a few initial just summary thoughts. First, that I believe that nonviolence is deeply grounded in the Christian biblical tradition, both in the words and in the witness of Jesus. We have a very solid base for understanding nonviolence. Secondly, that the theology and spirituality of nonviolence is evolving. It's developing in really interesting and I think very helpful ways. Third, that formation and education in nonviolence and about nonviolence is critically important because nonviolent skills are learned. We can learn how to be, how to function in nonviolent ways. And when we look around at our world, it's pretty clear that we need to do that. And then last, that I believe that the churches, and in particular the Catholic Church, are key in that formation and education, particularly because of the grounding in the biblical tradition that nonviolence has, and because of the global and the local reach of the church. The church is everywhere, and it is part of the local community. So um, we believe that were the Catholic Church to commit to teaching nonviolence, it would make a tremendous difference in the world. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. I'm going to say just a little bit about the context. Um, what are we observing around us? What do we mean by what is violence and what is nonviolence? What are we learning about the biblical and the Catholic Christian tradition related to nonviolence? What are some nonviolent practices that we're all learning these days? And what are some historical examples? And then I will send you or leave with you a link to resources that you might find useful as we go on. So let us just begin by looking first at the context in which we're living. Some of you may also have watched, I just watched a program planned by the Franciscan Action Network and Pace Bene Nonviolence Service about what are the 10 most effective steps we can take to protect in the United States, to protect our democracy. Very interesting, very serious times. At the same time, my one question to the presenters was, how do we bring together our commitment to addressing the violence and the deep injustices in the world, whether that's in the Middle East or in Sudan or in our backyard, with the need to protect our democracy? Two very huge challenges right at this time. So maybe just take a minute and think about the violence that you encounter, that you experience, however you do that, whether it's in the news or in your backyard or personally. What does that violence look like in the context where you are right now, wherever you are? And maybe just, if you want to, you could put a word or two in the chat just to share some of those ideas, or just think about it yourself, maybe jot it down on a piece of paper, because in a way, that's an important part of the context in which we're all living right now. It's not the whole context. There is goodness and commitment to change, commitment to justice, but violence is very significant. So just a minute for you to think about what that looks like in your own experience. I'm sure that some of you would think about Ukraine, and thank you. It's great to put them in the chat. We think about the wars in Ukraine and the attack on Israel in 2023, the violence in Gaza and the West Bank and in Sudan and Myanmar. Think about tribal violence and gang violence and cartels and mafia, street violence, gender violence, the violence of words and communication. It was very interesting what Pope Leo said the other day, or has said in the last short while, about the need to be careful about the violence of words and communication. I've come to believe that a better understanding of violence helps us to grasp the potential depth and richness of nonviolence. So I'm sure that you know very well Galtung's three types of violence from many, many years ago: direct violence that is visible and physical, structural violence that is social injustice, socioeconomic and health structures that are unjust, and so on, and cultural violence and aspects of culture that legitimize direct or structural violence, and on and on. What would you add to Galtung's description? Again, maybe just a word or two, either in the chat or just thinking yourself. What are the other forms of violence that we're seeing now? I think particularly about the violence that is being carried in social media or in the media, the principal media, rhetorical violence, and on and on. In the last 20 years or so, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and researchers like Dr. Bandy Lee, a forensic psychiatrist and expert on violence, have been greatly expanding our understanding of violence and all its dimensions and manifestations, from rejection, neglect, and deprivation, particularly at very early stages of life, to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the destruction of our planet at such a huge level. Dr. Lee describes violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Interesting to see her emphasis on intentionality, on both physical force and power, and on the potential for both physical harm and psychological harm. I know I see Dan has joined us, Dan Moriarty, and as the Maryknoll Missioners have been taking seriously your commitment to nonviolence organizationally a few years ago, I think it's really interesting to be learning from you, listening to your experience as you identify violence in the different contexts where you're living, as you listen to people with whom you're living and working, identify violence, and then try to understand as we try to understand what nonviolence looks like. But I think that nonviolence in general, we think of as a paradigm of the fullness of life that most faithfully challenges and could transform the culture of violence in which we're not caught, in which we are now caught. Nonviolence not only offers a qualitatively different way of challenging specific forms of violence and resolving particular conflicts, but it's also a stance against the entire framework or the culture of violence. It was I've been in Rome this week for a program that we are hosting tomorrow, but it's been very interesting to me in talking with some of the Vatican officials that we've met with, how specifically and clearly they're talking about a culture of violence and the need for a transformation from the culture of violence to a culture of nonviolence. And that is a significant shift in the last 10 years, I think, to a point that people are really beginning to understand nonviolence as a constructive process at a personal, interpersonal, and social structural level. And also that it is not, at least in the way we're using a description of nonviolence in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, is we are describing it as something quite different from pacifism, and also reminding ourselves constantly that nonviolence is never passive. Maryknoll Missioners understand nonviolence in terms of how it responds in violent conflicts as prevention, intervention, or reconciliation. And I think those are really important sort of markers in terms of thinking about what nonviolence might look like. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative promotes nonviolence that is both principled, it is the spirituality and a way of life, and strategic. Some would, and I think this would particularly true of those who work with sort of strategies of nonviolent intervention, the kind of which the Gene Sharp from Harvard had developed so many years ago. And they would tend to separate the spirituality and way of life that we believe is a very important part of how you live out nonviolence from strategic nonviolence that is works in many ways because of the because we as people have power, and we can withhold that power, and it isn't dependent on the conversion of someone who is being violent or creating harm, but that conversion is the conversion that we need to live through ourselves, that we need to be committed to nonviolence that is a spirituality and a way of life. We hope a global ethic and also a spectrum of nonviolent strategies and tactics that can interrupt, prevent, and prevent violence and protect vulnerable people. The definition that the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has come to for nonviolence is that nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a method for change, a universal ethic, and the creative power of love in action that promotes respect for the dignity of every person and the integrity of creation. It is a constructive antidote to direct psychological, structural, cultural, spiritual, and ecological violence that transforms the roots of violence, is broader than pacifism, and, as I said, is never passive. People often ask about the word nonviolence. Can't you come up with a word that is not a negative word? And I think, to my knowledge, nobody has been able to replace the sort of clarity of nonviolence that is evoked by using the language of nonviolence. It's an English translation of the Sanskrit term ahimsa, literally non-violence. And it's, I think, interesting, and you probably know this, Michael Nagler, the founder of the Meta Center for Nonviolence in California, I think explains very well that in Sanskrit, abstract nouns often name a fundamental positive quality indirectly by negating its opposite. Thus, courage is non-fear, kindness is non-anger, and love is non-hatred. Ancient India's great thinkers, Michael says, expressed themselves in this oblique way because they believed that love, absolute courage, compassion, and so on are primordial things that can't be fully expressed in fallible, conditioned human language. So Nagler says that ahimsa, nonviolence, a kind of double negative, actually stands for something so original that we cannot quite capture it with our weak words. Excuse me. So just briefly, what is nonviolence and what is not nonviolence? Why nonviolence is just not violent is, I think, a really important idea. So, for example, um, and again, most of you will know this, we have been pretty clear in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative about not hyphenating the word nonviolence. And Kazu Haga, who is a Kingian nonviolence trainer, has a very interesting short video where he describes his experience of coming upon a major altercation fight in the block right outside his apartment. And by the time he got out to see what was happening, there were 20 or 50 people standing around watching this fight. And he jumped in and pulled the two people apart who were fighting and prevented them from hurting each other. And he said that he believes that the difference between that all of the people who were standing around watching the fight were non-violent. They were not violent. But that what he did, which actually required the use of force more than what other people were doing, was nonviolent because it was not only interrupting violence or preventing violence, but it was also trying to right a situation that had become violent. So, small detail. It's been an interesting challenge as we've been working with, for example, Vatican News over the last 10 years to encourage Vatican News to not hyphenate nonviolence. And they've been pretty good about it, as have other publications. So maybe just move now for a few minutes to looking at the biblical foundations for nonviolence. In 2017 and 2018, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative invited scripture scholars, theologians, and from all over the world to participate in it was about a year and a half long roundtable process to explore the biblical roots of nonviolence, to share what they had all been working on or been thinking about. And we had one roundtable on the biblical roots of nonviolence, one on what might be a theological base for nonviolence, one on what would be a new moral framework if we moved away from the just war tradition, what were some case studies that were significant, and how could the church contribute to this? And this little piece about the sort of biblical, particularly the Hebrew scriptures, reflection on or look at violence and nonviolence is written up more fully in our book, Advancing Nonviolence. But essentially, what we said is that the Israelites were not simply more cheerful than the Babylonians who enslaved them. They saw the same world with the same violence, but they refused to resign themselves to it as just the way it is. God, they thought, was a revolutionary who wanted to change the world. This is what salvation meant, not plucking a few survivors from the wreckage of the world and installing them in heaven, but creating a new heaven and a new earth. So God begins this grand revolutionary project by calling a goat herder from Ur and gathering a small group of people around him. The election of this ragged group does not seem a promising way to start a revolution. Scripture scholar Gerhard Lofink explains it in terms of the nonviolence of God. Most revolutionaries, he says, use violence because they're short on time. There must be one grand upheaval in which the powers are overthrown. God, on the other hand, has all the time in the world. God is nonviolent. So God begins the transformation of the world by calling a small group to live differently so that people can see a beautiful life and join the movement voluntarily, not by coercion. Creighton theology professor Gordon Brubacher claims that the Hebrew scriptures' main message about warfare is no more, pointing to the new way, the new community that is expected of the people of God. Brubaker notes that Jesus specifically indicated that same passage from the Hebrew scriptures as his starting point for mission and ministry and as his expectation for the people of God. Increasingly, theologians, church leadership, and Christians in many parts of the world have come to see that nonviolence effectively characterizes Jesus' way, a way that combines both an unmistakable rejection of violence with the power of love and truth in action for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. In first century Palestine, where direct and structural violence were a way of life, as you know very well, think of the Roman occupation, but also the way that religious rules and rituals were being used to exclude whole groups of people, lepers and women and others. In that context, Jesus proclaimed a new nonviolent way of life that was rooted in radical inclusion, the beloved community, the unconditional love of God. Scholar both of scripture and of Gandhi, Terence Rinn, who wrote Jesus Christ, Peacemaker, A New Theology of Peace a few years ago, writes about the horrific violence experienced by people in Jesus' time. He describes in particular the crucifixion near Nazareth of 1,000 people accused of insurrection and of how that must have affected Jesus growing up. Rinn describes how the people of Jesus' time took up three options in response to the oppression they were experiencing. The Essenes chose flight. The priests and the Herodians chose accommodation. The Pharisees joined others who chose to resist and eventually decided to fight. Jesus, by how he lived and what he taught, offered a fourth way to the people of Israel: build an inclusive community, including those perceived to be the enemy, by using the power of nonviolent love, and engage in active nonviolent resistance to injustice, exclusion, and oppression, which involved taking risks and even being willing to suffer for others for the common good. In other words, in his own very violent times, Jesus proclaimed a new nonviolent order rooted in the unconditional love of God. He walked that path to the very end of his life, to the cross, where he took the evil, the violence upon himself rather than inflicting it on others, and overcame it by his suffering and death. Jesus' resurrection from the dead was what John Deere calls the vindication of nonviolence over violence. So maybe let's just take a minute, and I would invite your thoughts, comments, additions, changes, challenges to the connection between the scriptures, both the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, and nonviolence. Again, if you'd like to share something, just raise your hand, wave, or and we'll take just a minute for your thoughts, or you can write your thoughts in the chat if that's easier. But just a little bit of feedback. Any thoughts? We can see. I know you all know this better than I do. Feel free to.
Marie, there's a question in the chat.
Great.
So Kate asked, Howard Thurman wrote about Jesus's way of love beautifully, and Jesus and the disinherited. Oops, I guess that's not so much a question as a comment.
Nice.
But Marie, I have a question. What do you see as the obstacles for this theology taking hold in the church?
I I think that the theology that, at least in my experience as a, well into my adulthood, I had never really heard any description of how nonviolence was so present, especially in the life of Jesus, in sort of so I don't think there's an obstacle. I think that it's just not been taught, not been lifted up. And I think that I I know that I do, and I think that we struggle with the Hebrew scriptures and with the what feels like repeated examples of violence and overpowering with violence. But I find that the sort of the implication or the suggestion that the message through the Hebrew scriptures was sort of a movement away from violence, movement toward a different way of being. I don't think there are obstacles to that. Where I think there are obstacles is that in the practical application, I think that um, as the Christian community became responsible for the management of a state, of a government, there was a struggle to figure out how then do we continue to live completely without violence when we're responsible for protecting people in our care and so on. And I think that the many, many years of the just war tradition that was to have been a warning against going to war until it was absolutely the last resort. I think that it became so central that it lost its meaning, and I think that's where the obstacles are. Teresa, please, yes.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Teresa, I'm gonna, oh, there you
go. In Luke's beatitude, blessed are the poor, the word that Luke uses is ani, and it comes from the Anawim of the Old Testament. And what touched me is the opposite of ani is violence. So the first beatitude of Luke is really blessed are those who are non-violent on all levels of life.
Thank you, Teresa. That is beautiful. Thank you. So there's lots more that we can sort of explore there, but let me just continue and I want to go on to a couple of other in a couple of other directions, and we can come back to this and keep adding your notes in the chat. They're very welcome. Let me see. Okay, so I switched you back so I could see you all, and now I need to find my notes. So just to move on from there a little bit to talk about the direction in which church teaching on nonviolence has moved over the last, I think it's moved significantly in the last very short while, but certainly in the last 30 or 40 years, with lots of good reason. So, as you know very well, during the very first centuries after Jesus died, the community, the church, the community of Jesus' followers practiced the nonviolence that he taught and lived. They say, for example, that they didn't have to say that they were nonviolent because that was one of the defining characteristics of being a following Jesus. Later, the spirit of gospel nonviolence was maintained really throughout the centuries by particular individuals, communities, and movements within the church. And over the past century, this tradition of nonviolent Christianity has increasingly reemerged in church documents, in scripture scholarship, theology, Catholic social teaching, and very much in the lived experience of Christians around the world. The just war tradition, as I started to mention before, has been at the center of church teaching on war and violence and peace for well over 1,000 years, developed by Augustine in the 4th century and later by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. You know that well. For a long time, nonviolence and pacifism were relegated to the realm of personal spirituality. There was always a recognition that nonviolence was an important, a legitimate position, ethical stance, but it was considered to be not a stance that a government who was responsible for protecting a people could take. So war, violence, was considered legitimate, but within strictly defined limits, if necessary, to establish peace or defend the common good. That was the essence of the just war tradition. But as the centuries went on, and most especially in the last century, as the nature of war changed, as modern weapons became frighteningly destructive and increasingly impersonal, and as successful nonviolent campaigns for liberation from structural violence like colonialism or racism or occupation became better known, church teaching on war and peace slowly began to shift with increasing emphasis on nonviolence as a possible tool for public officials and on the restrictions intended by the traditional just war paradigm to make war extremely rare, a truly last resort. There was still, in recent years, there still remains some moral theologians who don't think to apply the just war tradition in a very restrictive way, but most do think about the just war tradition as as suggesting that war or violence are legitimate within strictly defined limits and so on. Given what we now know about the consequences of horrific violence and war, the cost in human life, so painfully visible in Gaza and the West Bank, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Israel, and in too many other places, given what we know about the psychological trauma, the moral injury, environmental damage, climate disruption, and on, given the vast resources spent on preparations for war, resources that we know are desperately needed for healthcare, food, security, education, and on for integral human development, the official church has been saying for a while that a just war, one that meets all the criteria of the so-called just war tradition, that a just war is practically impossible. Every pope, from Pius XII and especially John the 23rd, repeatedly and clearly articulated an abhorrence of war. Pope John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris, the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes, Pope Paul VI at the UN, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI repeated that warning. But the just war tradition remained central to Catholic teaching on war, and nations continued to spend vast fortunes. The U.S. military budget for next year is approaching $1 trillion on weapons and preparations for war, and almost nothing studying nonviolence or preparing nonviolent alternatives. Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that I'm connected with, that I've mentioned, is a project of Pax Christi International that began with a few simple questions. What if 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide had a full understanding of the power and effectiveness of active nonviolence and the connection of nonviolence to the heart of the gospel? What if we all knew how to apply nonviolent tools to diffuse conflict before it became violent? What if the Catholic Church committed its channels of communication and diplomacy, its spiritual, intellectual, and financial resources to promoting active nonviolence. What if Catholic schools and colleges and all of our educational capacities, seminaries, and on, committed themselves to helping us understand how nonviolence works? As you probably know, those questions and some others were discussed at a small conference on nonviolence and just peace that was held in Rome in 2016. It was co-sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace that existed then, and Pax Christi International. To that meeting, we brought 80 participants, many of whom came from contexts of violence and war, from Iraq and Afghanistan, Palestine, Uganda, South Sudan, Colombia, Guatemala, Afghanistan, and so on, Mexico, Sri Lanka, many more. People who had very deep experience with effective nonviolence under extremely challenging circumstances. What we shared in those days and what they convinced us of was that it was urgently needed for the church to move nonviolence to the center of its teaching. So that was when we started the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and it was the basis for the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence that we launched last September. I'm not going to say a lot more about the Nonviolence Initiative or the Institute, but I'd be happy to answer questions about it. The basis of our work is consistently the experience of people living and in contexts where violence is rampant, and their sense that nonviolence would be an effective response to the violence that they're living. Shortly after our conference in 2016, Pope Francis wrote the 2017 World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, style of politics for peace. It was a tremendous step forward. It was the first official church document on nonviolence specifically, and it was a really excellent description of nonviolence, but quite short. I apologize here, just a minute. Since that time, since the World Day of Peace message in 2017, there have been a steady stream of additional messages from the Catholic Church, joining with other Christian and other faith traditions to take seriously the call to nonviolence. I think we are very conscious of the fact that in many ways, there are other faith traditions that are way ahead of the Catholic tradition in embracing nonviolence and studying nonviolence. But the church has done really quite a lot in the last very short while. The encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which I'm sure most of you have read, set the stage for a way of being that is nonviolent. And in fact, when we ask about an encyclical on nonviolence, we're often referred to Fratelli Tutti, and both in its general thrust about living as about relationships of respect and justice. There are in Fratelli Tutti some very specific references to, for example, the illegitimacy of the death penalty, and to the fact that the just war, it is virtually impossible to apply the just war tradition in the modern time. There's a note in a footnote in Fratelli Tutti that makes that quite specific. Pope Francis went on to repeatedly try to move toward a more nonviolent world, although he rarely used the language of nonviolence. He decried the world wars that were being fought piecemeal. He said repeatedly there's no such thing as a just war. He called for the world to transform our conflicts without violence. He emphasized integral ecology, reminding us that the natural world has intrinsic value and is also a victim of war and violence. He highlighted the tremendous profit in war making and in marketing and trafficking in weapons. He called even the possession of nuclear weapons morally unjustifiable. He ruled out any legitimate reason for the death penalty. And Pope Leo has already spoken repeatedly about peace. You know that almost the first words that he spoke were about peace that is disarmed and disarming. And in the last few days, just a couple of days ago, he had a lot to say about nonviolence. He said on May 30th, he said, faced with wars, terrorism, human trafficking, widespread aggression, children and young people need experiences that educate them to the culture of life, dialogue, mutual respect. And first of all, they need witnesses of a different nonviolent lifestyle. Therefore, from the local and daily level to that of the world order, when those who have suffered injustice and the victims of violence know how to resist the temptation of revenge, they become the most credible protagonists of nonviolent processes of peace building. Very strong, very clear. So let's take just a few minutes to look at the effectiveness and diversity of nonviolent approaches to transforming conflict, including interpersonal conflict, to preventing or interrupting violence, and to protecting vulnerable people and the planet. I think that it's really important, and I think it is happening, that when we think about nonviolence, that we don't only think about how do we deal with the war in Ukraine, or how do we stop the sort of macro violence of our world, but that we recognize that nonviolence is applicable at every way of life. That, as I started to say before, we think of nonviolence as a spirituality, a way of life, that sort of principled nonviolence that was modeled by Jesus and by Gandhi. And we think of nonviolence as a broad spectrum of effective tools for dealing with conflict and violence, a kind of pragmatic nonviolence that is represented in Gene Sharp's 198 Ways of Nonviolent Action and Michael Beer's Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, that include many examples of using technology and sophisticated communications to apply in nonviolent ways. Again, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative promotes nonviolence that is a spirituality, a way of life, and a broad spectrum of effective tools for dealing with conflict and violence. To learn the skill, for example, of nonviolent conflict transformation or nonviolent communication can be life-changing. I'm sure you've heard, I've certainly heard former gang members in Los Angeles who've been touched by the phenomenal programs there, or former militia members in Sudan whose lives have been changed by learning the skills of dealing with conflict in nonviolent ways. But active nonviolence is also not simple or safe. We know that in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in Palestine, people who have applied nonviolent tools to dealing with extreme violence have risked injury or death. And that's, I think, important even in thinking about using nonviolence, learning how to use nonviolence, to remember that it can be a dangerous task. Nonviolent action certainly includes action for regime change, for changing a government, but it also includes everyday techniques and practices such as trauma healing and trauma-informed social programs, restorative justice practices in schools and prisons, which is a wonderful example in Brazil, thanks to Maryknoll. Applies to anti-racism training and organizing to end white privilege. It applies to unarmed civilian protection, like is provided by Nonviolent Peace Force and community peacemaking teams and Meta Peace Team and so on. It applies to civilian-based defense. The story of Denmark and Estonia during the Denmark during the Second World War, and Estonia in claiming its independence, you applied tools that were wielded by the civilian population that were extremely effective in place of military action. We know nonviolent communication is a skill. So my point is that there are a plethora of nonviolent tools, that nonviolence is also contextual, that certainly there are common approaches and probably universal strategies, but we certainly believe that nonviolence is always contextual and it's often traditional. So while the basic approach to transforming conflict between herders and farmers, for example, may be similar across cultures, other nonviolent tools are unique in a given culture. So in Mali, for example, there's a jester who traditionally enters into conflictual situations to break through the conflict with humor and kind of outrageous behavior. In Kenya, every Pokot woman has a leketio or birth belt that she wears for support when she's pregnant. She also wears it during war or conflict as a charm to protect her son from harm, including during cattle raids. At times when a mother is not in support of her son taking part in a conflict or a war, she'll refuse to wear the leketio. A woman may also refuse to wear the leketio at the peak of a fight or a war and lay it down between people who are fighting. And they say, will instantly stop fighting. It's taboo for a man to touch a leketio, and a man cannot force a woman to wear it. If he does, his action will warrant a curse. You may know the research of Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, which culminated in their 2011 book, Why Civil Resistance Works, the strategic logic of nonviolent conflict, and that demonstrated that nonviolent civil resistance, one of the many nonviolent tools that are available against even formidable opponents, including those with dominant military power, was twice as successful as armed struggle during the 20th century. They examined 323 violent and nonviolent campaigns against incumbent regimes or foreign military occupations between 1900 and 2006, and found that the nonviolent campaign succeeded in terms of stated political objectives about 54% of the time, compared to 27% for violent campaigns. Those numbers have shifted a bit in the years since their research. But sort of the fact that it seems consistently true that nonviolent approaches and strategies tend to be more successful than violent ones. We know some of those stories. We know about Gandhi's campaign to free India from British rule and Dr. King's deep understanding of nonviolence applied to the civil rights campaign in the US. But I think we generally don't remember what Denmark did in World War II, or about Estonia's singing revolution, or the People Power Revolution in the Philippines, or Lema Gabawi's interreligious campaign, Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, that ended the 14-year-long civil war in Liberia in 2003. The church, they say, and I've seen this referred to in a number of different studies, the church played a significant positive role in the third democratic wave in the 1980s. This, what some people call a Catholic wave, contributed to the fall of authoritarian regimes and to the rise of democratic institutions in various countries, particularly in Poland, Lithuania, Spain, the Philippines, and Brazil. That some researchers name the Catholic Church as one of the top 3 or 4 contributors to the resurgence of democracy in the 1980s and very early 90s. And they credit that to the shifts that were introduced by the Second Vatican Council that encouraged attention to social justice and human rights and so on in the church. The Catholic community around the world continues to bring, Catholic communities around the world continue to bring nonviolence alive today in many ways. And for example, you I'm sure know the story of Bishop Paridi Taban's Quran Peace Village in South Sudan, where bringing together people from different ethnicities and religious backgrounds who chose to adopt intentional practices to reduce communal violence and to live in harmony made a huge impact. You know, the Philippine Ecumenical Peace Forum in Mindanao that has implemented nonviolent communication strategies and restorative justice practices to foster effective interfaith dialogue for peace in an area that, as you know well, had significant political violence, identity-based armed conflict, ethnic and clan divisions, and rebel violence. In Fiji, not too long ago, the church helped to interrupt a coup attempt by publicly calling for nonviolent responses across the country using Facebook. And on and on and on. There are many, many examples in Croatia, in Kenya, in Mexico. And we can come back to some of those if you're interested. The study of Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth was groundbreaking in 2011. But now there are researchers engaged in nonviolence-related studies around the world. The data that they're collecting is available, for example, in databases, the Global Nonviolent Action Database, which is hosted by Swarthmore College, which offers free access to case studies on nonviolent action campaigns worldwide. It includes cases spanning over 400 years and in more than 100 countries. There's the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict has a resource library that has a rich collection of resources. Excuse me. The Nonviolence International Nonviolent Tactics database is available. The Nonviolence International and Rutgers University International Institute of Peace Digital Library of Nonviolent Resistance is available. Nonviolence International's leading change network sort of collects many of these databases to make them easy to find. So what's happening is that in a way that wasn't taking place 15 years ago, now there is significant research on what expression of nonviolent action is most likely to work under what circumstances, and how do we learn from each other to act nonviolently in effective ways. I think the situation in which we're living in the United States right now is that the response to it is very interesting, because what's happening is that centers that are known for doing trainings on nonviolent practices that might be effective are inundated with requests from individuals, from communities, from parishes, from universities, from people across the country who are asking for training in nonviolent strategies that could make a difference in protecting democracy in the United States. Two of the places where you can read some of the stories about nonviolent action that is happening at every imaginable level, from the interpersonal to the international level of war, are in Waging Nonviolence and in Nonviolent News that are published each week, bringing many stories of nonviolence in action to readers and illuminating the scale and scope of how nonviolence is actively engaging and shaping our world. And we'll send you a link that includes a easy way to get at sort of all of these resources at the end of after the webinar. So maybe just a sentence in summary, and then would really invite your comments, your additions, any questions that sort of help us think about what is it about nonviolence that is so important in these times, and how do we learn to apply it? We are talking about a paradigm shift, not just about a few actions, but a real paradigm shift, a cultural shift in how we're living. It's also true that the shift from a culture of violence to a culture of nonviolence is a long process, and it's not easy. So I think what we're starting to see is that shift really is beginning to happen. That what 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you would say the answer is nonviolence, people would pat you on the head and say, well, that's very nice, but it's not realistic. Nonviolence is not strong enough to respond to the kinds of violence that we're seeing in the world now. And that's not happening anymore. People are hungry to learn about how to use nonviolent tools and what a nonviolent spirituality or way of life might look like in an ongoing way. So let me just stop there and invite your thoughts, comments, whatever you'd like to add to the conversation. And thanks again for being here.
If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or else you can raise your hand with the react button. Call on you. David.
Dave?
Thank you, Marie. Nonviolence as a system for national defense of a country is the whole concept is pretty well underdeveloped, I think. And that's where boy, a lot of experimentation will need to be done, I would think. But I think it builds up to that. I think if what you're relaying tonight about nonviolent lifestyle and spirituality and strategy and means of conflict resolution, maybe it has to build up to the point where it could be implemented somehow as a national defense system. And then I have one more question after your comments.
Okay. Yes. There are examples. I mean, the example of what Denmark did during the Second World War, where the population of Denmark simply refused to cooperate with the German occupiers, Nazi occupiers, and that were quite remarkably successful in diminishing the consequences in Denmark. That is a story that is one of the examples in A Force More Powerful, which is on video and also in book. It's very interesting. But I do think, for example, in the beginning in Ukraine, in 2014, the experience of the Ukrainian uprising and challenges in 2014 led the Ukrainian population to be interested in trying to learn what civilian-based defense would look like, which would be a non-military national defense. When the Russians first invaded Ukraine, there were many local communities that resisted in very interesting and creative ways, turning street signs around, putting physical obstacles in the middle of the road so trucks and tanks couldn't enter, trying to befriend the Russian soldiers, to offer them a cup of coffee or tea and suggest that maybe they could, use a phone to call home to let their family know where they were. That kind of activity, they say, it wasn't enough to stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but they say that in the communities where that kind of resistance was practiced, that the injuries and death were diminished. Lots of learning that needs to take place. That the civilian-based defense has been an idea, obviously, since the Second World War. The people who worked around Gene Sharp at Harvard did quite a lot of work on that in the 70s and 80s. And I think there's a potential there, but it would take a lot of development. And I think it's a little bit the reason why, an example of why we differentiate between pacifism and nonviolence, because we don't want people to give up trying to use nonviolent means if they're not able to apply nonviolence in every circumstance. And so if you can't stop the war, we at least can deal with violence that's closer to us, and maybe we'll get to a point where we can do more at the level of national defense.
My second question, Marie, is, after the 2016 and 2019 conferences at the Vatican and kind of the birth and growth of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, there was always this kind of hope that maybe Pope Francis would write an encyclical on gospel nonviolence. And I think as he was writing other encyclicals and incorporating principles of nonviolence, it didn't seem necessary, and as time went on, it didn't seem likely. But dare we hope that with a selection of with Pope Leo XIV, dare we hope for that at some point? I know it's kind of premature, but what are your feelings?
Well, my guess is as good as yours, but we're certainly hoping, and we're already asking. So, partly because, of course, the Pope Francis, his own personal examples of how he lived, how he related to people, how he encouraged movement toward peace in so many places in the world, moved us in that direction. That World Day of Peace message was important. His encyclicals were important, but there's so much more that could be written about nonviolence at every level. The scriptural basis, theological basis, the sort of moral, practical. We're hoping, and we will continue to gently ask for that to be considered.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Time for one more question if there's a burning one out there.
Okay. It doesn't have to be a question. Add your own thoughts. Yeah.
Dorothy.
Well, this is a little bit further in context, but I was wondering, Marie, if you could offer any ideas on, after there are successful, because there have been throughout history, of active nonviolent resistance. I'm thinking of the Arab Spring in 2009. I was part of the Gaza Freedom March.
Yeah.
And then the Arab Spring came after that. And like, I can remember being so excited and hopeful because we had worked and met with some of the people of that movement. But then it seems like, where is the leadership?
Yeah.
How is, I guess I'm just asking from your expertise, if you have any references or resources on work that has been done after successful movements, how a democratic leadership could come into fruition, because a lot of times that seems like it goes so far and then that happens. That's all. And thank you.
No, it's a great question, Dorothy. I mean, there is evidence that, for example, since the Arab Spring and since Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan wrote their groundbreaking book, that those inclined to be repressive governments or dictators or, authoritarian, have learned how to interrupt some of the nonviolent strategies. And so I think what is happening, and it is happening around the world, but it's slow and frustrating. I mean, it feels now as though that in so many places in the world, we've gone backwards away from a move toward democracy and justice and a dignified life for everybody. But I think there is a lot of very basic work that is going on that I hope will break into that. It is discouraging. I don't think there's an answer for it, but it's surely being noted, and I am hopeful that the kind of research that has been going on for the last fairly short while will give us more clues about how to deal with that kind of failure, what feels like after success, then a failure. But I also think that and I don't have any evidence for thinking this except just what I believe, that one of the reasons why it's so important to think and talk and practice nonviolence at a sort of way of life level, spirituality and way of life, is that I believe that is also contagious, and that if we can create societies where people are learning to live in such a way that we build a stronger base for a just society, for a truly participative and democratic society, I think maybe we'll be more successful. I think that a recognition that we think of nonviolence as all about relationships, that it's about relationships between humans, relationships with the rest of creation, relationships with the earth. And that if we can build communities that are truly the beloved community, the alternative community, a different way of being, that we have a better chance of building a country that is able to sustain. The problem is, Duncan asked earlier about sort of what are the obstacles? What are the obstacles to, that in the church or anywhere else? And I think that the obstacles to moving in this direction are that one of the biggest obstacles is the profit in violence, that we have created an economic model globally where people who make weapons or foster violence are benefiting from that at tremendous levels. And so a huge challenge continues to exist. How do we stop it? What is driving the sort of ongoing violence? And I think part of it, and I appreciated a lot what Pope Francis said so often. He pointed to arms traffickers, arms dealers, people who were in the business of making war, of producing, encouraging violence. He continuously called them to account for what was happening, and I think maybe that's really hard because in our society, arms are produced in some part of the arms production or preparation for war is taking place in every congressional district in the country, they say. And so there's a tremendous amount of political support because it's about jobs and it's about our understanding of how can we be safe. And I think that to think about a culture of nonviolence, it's just going to take a very long time. And I think that that is true globally, in whatever places, wherever we can retrieve traditional practices that offer a different way, we need to do that. And I think what's happened has been sort of the opposite, that sort of the cultural onslaught of a dominant Western militarized, violent way of thinking is just sort of overwhelming the world. And I think we need to to really be able to have just peaceful, participative societies, we need to deal with some of that really basic violence that we just assume is part of life. And that's hard. It's going to take a long time. And I think it is, in many ways, the work of the Spirit, that it's not something we can learn how to be nonviolent, but I'm not sure that we can do it without the spiritual nourishment of imagining a different way. So
thank you, Marie.